Awesome. Okay, so it looks like we have a really good turnout today. I'm seeing around 39 people, so this is fantastic to see so many people interested in this very kind of important and relevant topic that we're going to discuss here today. The government as employer of last resort, evidence from a Canadian experiment. I'm really excited to hear what our presenter has to say about this today, and it's really relevant, I think, to a lot of the conversations that we're having right now. For those who don't know, my name is Martin Boucher, and I'm a faculty lecturer here at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, and I'm very pleased to be your moderator for today's event. Also, for those who don't know or who are new to the JSGS, Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, or JSGS, is a provincial center for advanced study and research in public policy administration. We are a partnership between the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan, which is very unique, that was based in the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that defines this province here in Saskatchewan. Since our inception in 2007, we have swiftly become one of Canada's leading policy schools for educating graduate students and public servants interested in and devoted to advancing public value. Although I may be biased, at this time I'd like to also acknowledge that although this is taking place online, JSGS's physical home is located both at Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. To help run things smoothly here today, I'd like to ask attendees to stay muted or turn off your video during the presentation and Q&A portion. To just give a quick overview of the format for the presentation, our speaker will present for 30 to 40 minutes. I've already asked him in advance if he is comfortable getting questions during the presentation, and he is. So if you have any questions during the chat, feel free to share it with everyone on the chat forum. And if I think it's sort of relevant to the flow of the presentation, I'll alert Marc-Andre to that. And also, following the presentation, we will have an opportunity to engage with what I hope is a really kind of lively discussion onto this very important topic. Also note that, as with all of our public lectures, this presentation is being recorded and we will be available for viewing on the JSGS website at a later date. So you will also have an opportunity to kind of see this presentation later if you want. Now that we have most of those formalities out of the way, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Marc-Andre Pigeon. He is a colleague of mine here at the JSGS. He's an assistant professor and a director of the Center for the Study of Cooperatives. He holds a PhD in mass communications from Carleton University and has worked in a number of economics and policy-related positions, most recently as Assistant Vice President of Public Policy at the Canadian Credit Union Association. Dr. Pigeon's academic background is in economics as well as communication studies. So he weaves these he wears two hats and weaves these sort of two pieces together, which I think leads to really interesting insights. He studied at Carleton University, the University of Ottawa, and the New School University in New York City. His research interests include the study of cooperatives, behavioral economics, psychology, income distribution, money and banking, and fiscal and monetary policy. So he is the perfect person to talk to us about what we're going to be talking about here today. So I will turn it to Marc-Andre. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. Welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk to you about an issue that frankly has not gotten a lot of attention in Canada, but that has been on the policy agenda in the United States. And I'll come to that in a moment. Before I kind of tell you a little bit about this idea, I want to set the table a little bit, because this idea of government as an employer of last resort, it's a big idea, but it's a big policy idea. This is a multi-billions of dollars. This would be a massive endeavor. But I like to think that we're in a moment in time, and the COVID crisis, I think, is really illustrative of this, where people are actually willing to contemplate big ideas. And the kind of current big idea du jour, the flavor of the month, is a guaranteed income. This is an idea, this idea of a job guarantee or employer of last resort is an idea that has historically traveled in parallel with the idea of a job income guarantee. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the income guarantee, then I'm going to back into the job guarantee. My objective today is to kind of familiarize you with this idea of a job guarantee or employer of last resort, and then kind of motivate some of the thinking around this by looking at a little known Canadian experiment. And it really is little known, but incredibly important, I think, for illustrating the potential benefits of a job guarantee. So that's kind of roughly my game plan. And so if we can go to the next slide, Karen, please. So I just mentioned a minute ago that this is kind of an era of big ideas. Even before the crisis, there's been a lot of talk about an income guarantee, motivated in part by concerns around artificial intelligence, around income inequality, dislocation from our kind of increasingly open, but maybe less so now, economy. And so when the crisis hit, this idea kind of really took off, right? We've got federal transfers of $2,000 a month to people who've lost work. And suddenly people are really seizing on this idea that maybe government should consider something bigger and more universal. In fact, I was one of the co-authors here. I'm in the et al. After Dion Puller's name, who wrote a piece in the National Post, that appeared in the National Post, promoting this idea of a basic income. Now, I have to say that I've long been more of a fan of a job guarantee, but I saw this as an opportunity to kind of broaden the discourse and at least give some ammunition to people who are thinking about these big ideas. So this is just an example of how I think we're in this era of big ideas. If you go to the next slide, please, Karen. In the US, in the run for the Democratic nomination, we had Andrew Yang, who had an income guarantee as a kind of centerpiece of his platform. Again, just to kind of illustrate how this idea was already bubbling well before the crisis, but it's just taken on a new kind of vigor. And by the way, I think Martin might have mentioned this, but please do feel free to ask questions as we go. I'd really love to have more of a conversation than just a presentation. So the next slide, I'm going to go one more of these guaranteed income slides. I call this, so it's on the US agenda, it's on the Canadian agenda, and it's on other agendas. I'm a little joke about some higher spiritual agendas. The Pope has apparently backed a universal basic income and a lot of other stuff. He made some kind of noises in this direction at his Easter ceremony or kind of speech. And so just to emphasize again how big this conversation has become, both before, but especially since the COVID crisis. Now, this other idea of a job guarantee, though, is also had some traction lately, but mostly before the crisis. And that's kind of interesting in and of itself. So we'll come back to that. Maybe we can talk about that after. If we can go to the next slide, Karen. So there is this competition for the income guarantee idea, and it's this job guarantee idea, this employer of last resort idea. In fact, this was a centerpiece of a lot of discussion. The Green New Deal, Alexandria Ortiz-Cortez's kind of Green New Deal package. The kind of progressive wing of the Democrats have been putting forward this idea for the last year or two. And then if we go to the next slide, it was a centerpiece of Bernie Sanders' campaign. And for a while, it looked like it might really move up the agenda, right, into the kind of core list of issues for decisions. Bernie had this as a feature, and for a while, he was leading the Democratic nomination campaign. And so it looked like this issue might actually supersede the income guarantee as a big idea appropriate for this era. But of course, Bernie Sanders didn't get to the finish line, and then COVID struck, and things have kind of shifted quite a bit. We go to the next slide, please. So this is just a reminder then, just to kind of give you a flavor of what I'm going to talk about. I've kind of set up the story a little bit, a bit of context, but I'm going to give you a bit of history and definition around what this job guarantee idea is. I'm going to look at this case study, this Community Employment Innovation Project. This is the case study that I want to talk about, the Canadian experiment that took place in the early 2000s in Cape Breton. And then I want to take some lessons from that to inform the way we might think about a job guarantee or in fact, an income guarantee or both. So that's kind of the end point of all this conversation. So I'll just pause there and ask Karen to move next slide, but I'm happy for questions. Now, one thing to really, I think, stress, and part of the reason I went through this kind of I talked a bit about the income guarantee in the context of the job guarantee is because there's something about the context, the circumstances that we live in today and that we lived in even before the COVID crisis that seems to compel thinking around big issues. And I'll tell you why in a minute, but these are the kind of current big issues that are happening now, right? Of course, COVID-19, but prior to this, there was already problems and concerns about income and wealth inequality. It's one of the JSGS's focus areas. Economic instability was always kind of at the top of our concerns. Geopolitical tensions, this is kind of a relatively new development perhaps, but in the last 10 years, we've seen the rise of China and US tensions reflecting that. And then of course, there's climate change and artificial intelligence and potentially job loss. Now, what's interesting about these observations of these big contextual pieces is that we've lived these things before. In the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, there was a similar and equally vigorous debate pitting the income guarantee against the job guarantee. And the circumstances were in some ways remarkably similar. It was the birth of the environmental movement. This was the period where the environmental movement was really starting to kind of take off. There was, of course, geopolitical tensions, mostly with the Soviet Union at the time. But there was a lot of concern about computers. This is when computers were kind of really starting to come onto the scene, and people were really worried about job loss. If anyone's watched Mad Men, you might remember a season where the computer was kind of a central character and it was provoking terror in the ad executive world. This is symptomatic of that period, just like it is today. And it was also, interestingly, the start of a long trend towards growing income and wealth inequality that kind of took root at precisely the moment where this debate about income and jobs, or income guarantees versus job guarantees, was taking place. And the last piece is on the economic instability. We were living a major structural change at that time, moving from this kind of post-war, very Keynesian, Bretton Woods kind of exchange rate system to something else. And people weren't sure what the something else was. There was a concern about what this future would look like because we were shifting the structures of our society, just like we probably are now. And so that's when these ideas, these big ideas, start coming to the fore. That doesn't mean that they're only appropriate for big moments, but it does give you a sense of why these issues are kind of starting to bubble up now as opposed to, say, 10 years ago. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So that's a bit of the context. Now, in the it's important to understand that this idea of a job guarantee, which I'll just define very simply for now as an unconditional promise by a central authority, in this case it'd be the federal government or the US federal government, to hire anyone willing and able to work. That's what a job guarantee is. And so if you lost your job, you were able and willing to work, there would be a job waiting for you through government-funded job. And I'll describe what those jobs might look like in a minute. But the inspiration for this idea of a job guarantee, can trace back, and it's largely a US idea. It's important to understand this idea is really emanated largely from US policy experience and research experience. So in the Great Depression, there were two big government employment projects, the Work Project Administration and the Civil Conservation Corps. These projects, these plans employed millions of Americans. They did incredible things. If you've traveled in the United States, if you've stayed in a national park in the United States, you've encountered likely the output or the fruit of those hiring sprees. They built trail systems, they built cabins, they built refuges, they basically made the US park system usable. There's murals all over the United States, from every small town to every big city, that were painted by artists that were hired through these programs to bring their art into the public domain. They were hiring theater goers, people who were actors to put on plays for communities big and small throughout the United States. They planted millions of trees to arrest soil erosion, which of course was a problem, particularly in the Midwestern United States. They did massive projects at dam works, endless infrastructure, all flowing out of this. So there were real outcomes from these hirings, these millions of people that were hired. Canada didn't quite, to my understanding anyway, didn't quite engage in this project as vigorously. We did have work camps, but they tended to be a little less, I guess, publicly spirited, a little more of the ditch digging variety, a little less creative than our American friends down south. And then if you look to 1944, this idea that you should have a right to a job an idea that had a lot of roots in the Great Depression and the high, 20, 25% unemployment rates, was enshrined in the United States in an economic Bill of Rights. This idea that you had a right to a decent job sufficient to house, feed, dress, and even enjoy some leisure was enshrined in these Bill of Rights. It was policymakers tried to give it some purchase in this Employment Act. They didn't quite get there. They said, let's run the economy hot enough to achieve a maximal employment rate or a minimal unemployment rate. And to be fair, for the next 2.5, 3 decades, they were largely successful. U.S. unemployment rate is often in the 2 to 3% range. People forget this. They think, when we see a 4 or 5% unemployment rate now, we think this is a great thing. In the context of that post-war period, that was a horrible thing. When the unemployment rate went to 4 or 5%, this was viewed as a calamity, a bad outcome. It's amazing how time changes our perspective on these things. But again, these were people that were coming out of the Great Depression. They knew the value of work and the importance of work for one's mental health and well-being. And so they were really intent on kind of trying to lock that in. For the next 2 or 3 decades, the issue didn't disappear, but legislatively, the next big milestone was this Humphreys-Hawkins Act, which gave the Federal Reserve a mandate, the central bank in the United States, a mandate to target full employment. Just one last note before we jump ahead. Interestingly, in this period, Richard Nixon came this close to putting in force something like a job guarantee. He started with the idea of an income guarantee, and this is how these issues, again, always travel together. He started with an idea of an income guarantee, but got a little nervous about that idea of just giving people money, and started working towards something more akin to a job guarantee. In the end, it didn't see the light of day, but the issue was that prominent, that much on the agenda that it almost came to be. So it's just, again, important to understand that these are, while we may seem these ideas as a bit utopic today, they were very, very close to being enforced then, and could be in the future. So next slide, and of course I'm happy for questions if there are any. One other thing to note is that this idea of a job guarantee has long been associated with struggles by minorities, women in particular, who've seen this as an important element of distributional equity and other kinds of equity. And so Martin Luther King made this idea of a job guarantee a centerpiece of his own advocacy. In fact, there's a lot of African-American researchers, economists, who've taken up the mantle of a job guarantee precisely because, in part anyway, because they believe, as did Martin Luther King, that this was probably the best way to lift up a lot of African Americans out of poverty. And just incidentally, I was involved in the early 2000s on a major study into rural poverty, and we traveled all over Canada, including rural Saskatchewan, and we heard in a number of occasions from Indigenous communities who told us repeatedly how much they valued the idea of work, and that they would rather get work opportunities than just income transfers. And so this idea, again, I think it has really important potential consequences for a range of issues, not just housing and clothing people, but also larger equity issues. So this is a bit of context, to get yet more context. It's important to recognize that late 70s, after that Humphreys-Hawkins Act, the issue disappeared. It really fell off the agenda. We had Ronald Reagan, we had Margaret Thatcher, in our own Canada, we had, of course, Brian Mulroney, and leaders like them all over the world kind of came to power with a mandate to shrink government, not expand it. And so this job guarantee idea, as did the income guarantee, really kind of fell off the table. And it was only kept alive, and if we can go to the next slide, by a small group of, I'd call, eclectic economists who worked in this quite lovely place. This is my former office as well, in the late 90s, called the Levy Economics Institute, which is housed at a place called Bard College in the Annapolis Valley not the Annapolis Valley, sorry, the Catskills, near the Catskills, the Hudson Valley, just north of New York City. And this group of economists, if we can go to the next slide, I'll just kind of give you a flavor of who they are. There's a little bit of animation here, Karen, so I'll tell you. Oh, there it is. I'm circling Pavlina Cherneva because she is probably the leading job guarantee academic, the one who's done the most to develop the idea in terms of its kind of institutional design features. But there are other people that are worth noting here, and I'll just flag them very quickly. On the bottom left, just below Pavlina, is a guy named Bill Mitchell. He's an economist in Australia, extremely prolific. He developed independently of these other researchers this idea of a job guarantee, even though there was no history in Australia, based on his agricultural research, his research into how successful agricultural organizations manage their supply of research, of output, to time it to when markets need it most. So we started thinking about, can we hire people from a macro perspective, macroeconomic perspective? Can we kind of almost have a policy that adjusts the stock of employment based on private sector demand and supply? And so government would be that buyer of last resort in a sense, just like there are agricultural buyers of last resort. There used to be anyway in Canada. So what if we did something like that with people? That was basically the approach he took. Next to Bill is a guy named Randy Ray, who was my mentor in the United States, had deep influence over me. Another guy named William Darity, one of the African-American researchers who's active in this area. Up on the right is a guy named Warren Mosler. Warren Mosler is a billionaire hedge fund manager who's been extremely active in economics, believe it or not, and is a bit of a Wall Street, Bay Street god for he's developed all sorts of trades that people use now all the time. But he independently as well came up with this idea because he has an interest beyond just making money. And then lastly, in the middle here is Stephanie Kelton, sorry, it used to be Stephanie Bell. Stephanie Kelton, my former colleague, and who was going to be our Tansley lecturer. She was also instrumental in kind of building up these ideas and keeping the flame alive during the subsequent, two and a half decades where it really took a backseat. So if we can go to the next slide, please. One of the ideas, one of the critiques that immediately comes to the fore if you mention this idea of government hiring people to work, one of them, and there's many, one of the big critiques is this would come more from the kind of left of the spectrum. This sounds like workfare. This sounds punitive. This sounds like people are going to be doing jobs that are uninteresting, digging ditches, just boring, not real jobs. And then from the right of the spectrum, this would be seen as a big government, of course, intrusive on the private sector, wasteful because only private sector creates jobs. And so you know the tropes. These are the standard critiques that would be brought to bear. Of course, the people, the scholars behind this idea, and the activists, because there is an activist community behind this as well, have thought this through. They've kind of addressed these critiques. And so I'm going to go to the next slide and give you a flavor of what some of the key design features look like. So I've already mentioned the unconditional job offer, but another important piece of this is to avoid competition with the private sector. This was a major concern in the Great Depression with the Work Project Administration and other programs. It was a concern when Nixon was considering this. It's been a concern forever. And people who think about these things are very sensitive to this issue and are very purposeful about saying we are not going to do that. And how they're going to achieve that, how they're not going to compete with the private sector is they're going to play in the space where the social economy and not-for-profit sector is. And they're not going to compete with them, but they're going to work with them. That's where the jobs are going to get created, by these places that we know are always looking for work. If you've been paying attention to the COVID crisis, we know the food banks and all those kind of social services have been looking for help. Well, this would be the kind of situation where they would be increasing their employment. They would be hiring people with government funding to do the things that need to be done. It's important to stress, and this is one of the major critiques against the guaranteed income idea, is that this would not subtract from existing programs. It would be a complement to and add to existing programs. And I know what you're thinking, how are we going to afford this? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. And what kind of work conditions would these jobs be? Well, it'd be a living wage. That's important, not nothing. Flexible wage, flexible hours. You'd get vacation pay. You'd have educational opportunities. In the United States, you'd have healthcare. They extend Medicare into this space. You'd have childcare as well. So this would be a real job. It'd be a job that you'd want, a job that could mean a difference for your family. And crucially, on the funding question, and I'll come back to this again and again because I know people are going to raise this, the funding would happen from the nation state level, not the provinces, not the municipalities, not a state level, but a sovereign level where a central bank resides. This is an important point, and we can talk about this more afterwards. Next slide, please. And by the way, I'm happy for questions. So Martin, please give me a flag if you see anything. Okay, so what are the advantages of this way of framing the job guarantee? Well, of course, to the people who get the job, there's a fair wage and good work conditions. But for the larger community, there's also this kind of idea of you're deepening your social networks. That's what work does. This is what the research shows unequivocally. that when people lose their jobs, they lose social networks. This causes incredible mental distress and has real consequences. We call these despair deaths. In fact, people often die. Mortality rates rise in recessions. We know because of these, in part, social consequences, but for other reasons as well. The people who take these jobs have these workplace skills that they acquire. They get better socialized into the idea of work and workplace norms. They acquire technical skills. They get the mental health benefits. And in the design that we're talking about, the community gets goods and services. Remember when I talked about the work project administration, the Civil Conservation Corps, you know, those legacies of parks that people want to go to, murals that embellish the terrain and give people quality of life, those are real things. Those are things that really matter. And this kind of product of makes people feel proud. So you want people to be prideful of their work. And so this is how you would do it. So if we go to the next slide, please. I like to think of this as and one more slide, one more push of the button, Karen. This is my animation, very poorly done. I like to think of this as an anti-Gresham law. It's, you know, that Gresham's law is that bad money chases good, right? Bad money pushes out the good money. So people hide their coins of gold and they'll use as much as they can the kind of fiat money that governments create. This is the story of Gresham's law. There's actually problems with it. But anyway, in this model, good jobs push out bad jobs. If you have the choice between a job in this job guarantee program that's going to pay you all these benefits and these, you know, have all these advantages, you're not going to settle for a job that doesn't have that. And so it sets a norm and a benchmark that becomes really important for the private sector. It doesn't push out the private sector, but it forces the private sector to kind of come into line with these benefits. And I saw there's a question there.
Mark, we have our first question there, Marc-Andre,
yes.
from Anastasia.
Yes.
The training for specialized jobs can be included in this idea of job guarantee if there are no qualified people but space for positions.
So absolutely, training is very important. In fact, when we look at this Community Employment Innovation Program, the Canadian pilot project that we're going to talk about momentarily, they actually had a training component, and you could choose the kind of job you want to do. And so in this world, there would be an effort to tier, if we were to put this policy in place in the way that people have said it should be, there'd be an effort to kind of tier people, align people with their skills and interests, and offer them the skills training that they need. Now, within the scope of not pushing against the private sector. So there'd be constraints. It's not anything and everything you want, but there'd be a lot of opportunity to kind of move up the skills ladder through these programs.
If I'm reading in between the lines a bit on this question, what about if there's like a gap, right? What if there's like underserved sectors as a result of this? I think that's sort of a bit what this question
is.
Oh,
because you're pulling people out of the economy? Well, that's out of the private sector, you mean? I guess this is an important, there's an important macroeconomic element to this, and I'm going to get to in the next slide, that kind of relates to this point, this concern. Again, the idea is if the service is, look, if people aren't happy with the conditions elsewhere and they're working in this space, then it's up to the private sector, or this would be the response anyway, it's up to the private sector to kind of change the terms of its employment and make them more attractive, to pull people out of the job guarantee. There's no reason anyone's obliged to take this job. Again, it's a voluntary job. You don't have to work in the job guarantee, but it's an option for you to go to. The other thing I'd say is that for the most part, the experimental evidence from this project and the evidence from other countries is most of the people who would be going to this program have very low skills, have probably maybe never worked, have had no real opportunities in life. They have no socialization into the work-life balance process. They maybe are kind of socially marginalized as well. So this is a real opportunity for those people to kind of get in and improve the overall capacity, our human capital capacity in society. So I don't see that as a big concern. I see that actually the design of this program is meant to improve the capacity for people to step into those higher skilled jobs. And yet still have that opportunity to absorb people who just say, you know what, I want a different life. I do want to work in the social economy and I want to apply my skills there. So I might go to the next slide, Mark, and then we can come back if there's another question, because I want to hit on this point again. The architects of this job guarantee, a lot of them are macroeconomists, and it's important to understand that. They frame this policy intervention both from a kind of micro perspective, but a lot of time the work is around the macroeconomic advantages, and they're significant. So there's this inequality effect that's really important. It becomes an effective minimum wage. This is the point I was trying to make earlier, a minimum standard for jobs in the private sector. It improves the human capital productivity of a lot of people who've not had a chance to get into the job ladder. You know, there's a saying in labor economics that the first hired are the last fired, right? In any kind of downturn, it's the last people who get hired. When employers are finally desperate enough, and I don't like using that term, but if they're desperate enough to start hiring a person they would not normally hire because they just need the manpower, the human power, those are the people they're first going to fire when things go south. They're going to let those people go, and that's the plight of low-income people. They are the last people hired and the first fired. This program would help them climb up the rung of skills and capacity. The other thing that this thing does is it has minimal impact on inflation, in part because you're improving productivity. You're improving the productivity of a huge swath of the population that otherwise aren't able to contribute in their fullest capacity. This is important. People have a lot of latent capacity, and our current approach to managing that is just letting it atrophy. And I think it's a crime. So the final point on the macro part that's really important is this understanding of a macroeconomic stabilization. This is an automatic stabilization program. The population of people that would be growing into this thing would grow in a downturn and shrink in an upturn. As the economy improves, people would be saying, you know what, I've got a few skills now. Maybe I would like to work for a private company. Maybe I'll start my own business. And they have now the skill and the confidence to do that because the economy is growing. And so government spending moves in precisely the counter-cyclical way we want it to work. And it does so automatically without having to, without policymakers having to time things just right. This is the big critique against a lot of discretionary macroeconomic stabilization. This program adjusts consequently based on events, and this is probably one of its most significant benefits, apart from the real meaning it would bring to people's economic lives and other lives. So, Martin, is there another question? I still see the chat lit up there. I don't know if...
No, we're good. You answered
okay.
There's no more new questions.
Okay, perfect. So this macroeconomic advantage is really important. Karen, can I go to the next slide, please? Just lastly, there's been some effort to model this idea of a job guarantee in the US, largely by those people I just showed you. By the way, William Vickery, a former Nobel Prize winner in economics, was a big fan of a job guarantee. I didn't have him in there because he was not as prominent in the research, but he was a very substantial, important supporter. So when they modeled this, in 2018, they figured that in the US, if this program were in place, by 2022, there'd be about 15 million people working in this program. 15 million people at $15 an hour, having Medicare and having childcare. There'd be 4.2 million jobs created in the private sector. GDP would go up by $560 billion over the last 7 years of the 10-year simulation. Budget deficits would go up 1.53% per year for the first 5 years, and then 1.13% thereafter. To give you a sense of how big that is, in the current stimulus, we're talking 8% of GDP in Canada. Japan's 20%. Many, many countries are much, much, much higher than these numbers. And if we'd had this program in place, it would be working right now, automatically offering people money and work in the kind of this unprecedented scenario. And then what about inflation? There is a slight uptick in inflation early on, and by the end of the 10-year simulation period, basically nothing. So these are huge macroeconomic benefits that I think really need to be thought through. Now, just before I get to the employment program in Canada, we go to the next slide, please. It's important to frame the way we've been making our choice around these questions today. The way we do macroeconomic adjustment to depressions and downturns and COVID-19 is we let people suffer. We let unemployment rise, people lose their social networks, their mental health stress consequences, their family consequences, they lose capacity and talent and skills. Or we do precarity in the form of gig work and piecework and mechanical Turks of the world. These are the choices we make as a society. Or we do a decent, well-paying job, and that's the job guarantee. So it's just important to frame this from the perspective of the choice that we make as a society. Very rarely do we do it explicitly. We just do it by rote, by implicit assumption. If we can go to the next slide, please. John Maynard Keynes said, it is crazily improbable that, that people would believe that it's financially sound to maintain a tenth or more, or whatever the number is, of the population in idleness. And it's the sort of thing no one could believe if they'd not had their head fuddled with nonsense for years and years. So this is an idea that you can, John Maynard Keynes was very active in the debates then, and he was kind of aware of these things, and this is how he was framing it. Just lastly, there are two examples I want to draw to your attention around the implementation of this program. If we go to the next slide, please. In Argentina, there's the Plan Jefas de Hogar, I shouldn't even try. The unemployed heads of household plan, basically, that was created with the advice of some of those economists I told you about in the early 2000s. They quickly, in Argentina's massive economic crisis in that moment, within 6 months, this program was up and running, 2 million people working in it, 5% of the population, 13% of the labor force, and they had huge outcomes, huge drop in poverty. If we go to the next slide. And interestingly, people really liked their job. Now, this was a bit of a leading question, but there you go. This is what I have to work with. People liked the job because they could do something. I could help with my community. I work in a good environment. I learned something. Income was down the list, which I found kind of interesting. But it's this idea that people really want to give back to the society, and they want an opportunity to do that. And our society, the way we currently structure is we rob people of that opportunity at downturns, and even at upturns. There's a huge swath of the population that don't really get a chance to get into the game. Next slide, please. Oh, animation here. This is a finding from a World Bank study from this Jeffe's program. Look, their program did partially compensate many losers from the crisis and reduced extreme poverty. That's the big conclusion. So this program worked. It may not have been perfect. It didn't embody all the design features that Pavlina would have liked, but it made a big difference in people's lives. If we go to the next slide, please. Just one more mention before we really get to the meat of this. India has something like this for rural employment. It's a rural employment guarantee program where you have a right to a job, 100 days of work a week per head of household, and per year, minimum of 100 days of work per year per household. And it too has had some kind of salutarious or beneficial effects. So if we can go to the next slide. Now I'm going to talk to you about the Canadian experiment. So this is this Community Employment Innovation Project, 1999 to 2006. It was not intended as a job guarantee program, but it embodied many of the features of the job and guarantee program, and as designed by Pavlina Cherneva. And so that's why I want to talk about it. If we go to the next slide, please. So the people who put together this pilot project, and I'll tell you about it in detail in a minute, they were trying to say, what can we learn from all the failed efforts to hire people through government in the past? And one of the things, these are the kind of big learnings that they took away from previous experiments with some small targeted interventions. So a lot of these policies in the past, this is in Canada now, were targeted uniquely to the unemployed, people who just lost their job, usually in a given sector. Could have been forestry or mining or fisheries. And the policymakers were primarily concerned about dependence. They wanted these people to come and get some money for a little while and get right back on their jobs, get back to their fishing job, get back to their mining job, and move, ideally, exercise their mobility. The projects were short of duration and menial in their tasks. Most of the people who worked in them did not see them as real jobs. There was no training or education. Communities had little or no control over the jobs. The job creation was focused on private sector interests and benefits in the medium to long run and short run. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So they said, okay, that's how things have worked in the past. Can we do them differently? Can we think about a different design? Again, they weren't reading the job guarantee literature. These are a completely different world, but they ended up in a lot of the same place. So can we offer a period of stable employment, community-based projects that are attractive to unemployed workers and those on income assistance? That should be in there. That's one of the questions I want to focus on. They want to focus on the skills question. Do people get their skills that help them improve their labor market outcomes afterwards? Next slide, please. Can communities generate projects that provide meaningful work? This is important. So if you're going to make communities do this, can they actually do it? That's an important question. That's one of the questions that this program wants to ask. Will this lead to long-term capacity growth and capacity in the community and in the broader market and social networks? That's another question. I'm going to focus on the highlighted beige questions for the rest of this talk. Next slide, please. And finally, because there's this overarching concern about the fiscal side of things, and it's one that we'll come back to, is this a cost-effective way to kind of get help to people in these economically depressed communities? So next slide, please. Those are the research questions that were asked. And then there's the policy intervention. It's a pilot project. Their objective, again, was to reintegrate workers into the labor market, increase human capital, support the social economy, and do all that in a cost-effective manner. They were going to do this by job creation. The community was going to create jobs with the help of the social economy, just like Pavlina suggests. The program offered $30,000 for communities to organize themselves with a democratic structure. So these jobs were created through a democratic process. The employment would be of long duration, not just 6 months or 3 months or 9 months or a year, but up to 3 years. The work week would be 35 hours, like a normal job, with employment insurance as an option. Next slide, please. The work conditions were really interesting. You would have a community wage. At the time, that was about $8, $9 an hour. This is in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. I'll talk about that in a minute. You had vacation option, you had vacation accrual, you had optional health benefits that you could pay a little bit towards. You had training and educational opportunities. You could even design your own job. You can change jobs within the program. You can leave the job and come back, but not if you went and collected EI or income assistance. So if you went on unemployment insurance, if you went back on unemployment insurance or income assistance, you couldn't come back into the program. But importantly, you were not, this design feature didn't force you to take this job. It was an option, just like the job guarantee program that the people at the Levy Institute are proposing. It was targeting an area of Canada that at the time had a 20% unemployment rate, so remarkably high. This is a Great Depression era unemployment rates. Even at the end of the period, the rate was still close to 15%. So it was a really challenging environment for anyone who wanted a job. If we go to the next slide, please. Now, the method by which the policymakers were going to assess the effectiveness of this program are really important to just fly through here. What I love about this study is that it was extremely well thought out. They had a treatment and control group. So they matched people who were going to get access to the program with people who didn't have access to the program. And then they want to see what are the difference in outcomes between the people who had the program and the people who didn't. And so what they did is they recruited 1,500 people, 1,000 on EI, 500 on social assistance. They assigned half of those people to the treatment group, the people who would benefit from this job program. And then they would compare those people with the 750 who didn't. They were matched by age, gender, other circumstances, other relevant demographic variables, and so that they could draw robust conclusions. And they also did a comparison of communities themselves. So they would match communities where there was an intervention with communities where there wasn't intervention by population size, demographic, economic, industry, and so on. So there's very well thought out program, policy project. And then they had a second theoretical methodological frame. They used something called the theory of change method, where they would consult with the community at the going in phase and say, what do you think is going to happen to this with this program? How should we design it? And then they would compare those predictions from the community with the outcome. So they used the community as their basis of legitimacy to then compare the outcomes against. So this is their two big kind of methods for kind of drawing robust conclusions. If we go to the next slide, please. The kind of work that got created was precisely the kind of work that the job guarantee people say we would expect. So environmental beautification, health and safety, recreation, arts and culture. Does that sound familiar? It sounds like the Great Depression programs. Services for the poor and the unemployed. This is soup kitchens, think that kind of thing. Support for seniors. So we talk a lot about this today. And what would, in the COVID crisis, again, this would have built some capacity there. Support for youth, important. And of course, these other really important segments of the society, disabled people and people working using other government services. So these were the kinds of jobs by project type. And so really important services that the private sector maybe plays on the periphery around, but doesn't really engage because there's no money to be made. And for the most part, there's not a lot of money to be made here. So if we go to the next slide, please. What happened in the program? Here's the program take-up. From the people who showed up and said, yeah, I'm interested in the program. If you look at the EI sample, from day one, when the recruitment started and the program kicked off, they almost got to 80% of the people who said, I'm interested, showed up for work. By the end of the program, that number had fallen, but not much, 65%. People stayed in the program. The numbers are even more dramatic on the IA sample, the income assistance sample. Numbers fluctuated downward a tiny bit, but stayed remarkably high. What does this tell us? To me, this says, and it's the conclusion the report draws, this says the program was good at generating good jobs. They weren't paying these people a crazy amount of money, but they were offering them an opportunity to do something meaningful in their community, and people really valued that. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of this, again, a different frame of this data, a little slightly different measure. Full-time employment rates, if they compare the program, the people who got the program with those who were in the control group. So the dark black line is the program, the slightly larger solid line is the control group, and the dotted line is the difference. You can see the employment rate for those in the program far exceeded by a third or more the employment rate for those who didn't benefit from the program. When the program came to an end, that situation changed dramatically. They didn't have access to those jobs anymore, and they were at a slight disadvantage relative to those who were already in the market, but they before too long got back to the same place. So that's important. That's an important finding. If we go to the next slide, this is the same story, but for the income assistance sample. So we saw the employment assistance, now we're looking at the income assistance. So remarkable labor market attachment throughout this period, this 3-year period. And then of course, when the program ends, everyone's out, but people slowly kind of come back to where the control group would have been or was. Next slide, please. So one of the, I think, really interesting findings back to the skills question is this is for the EI sample, the people that came into the program who were collecting employment insurance. A lot of those people relative to the control group. So the control group stayed in sales and services, these kind of very, I'd say, low-skilled occupations, what would be often characterized as low-skilled, and generally migrated to higher skill jobs. So business administration, finance, natural sciences and related, health, social sciences. And so this is a remarkable outcome of the program. There was a transition from people who otherwise would have been in kind of more sales type jobs, McDonald's type jobs, into kind of higher skill jobs. So this, back to that question, this is important. It's creating a shift that probably would motivate more automation in the places where it should be happening, right? And using more of our human skills in the place where they make sense. And if you looked at the AI, the income assistance sample, there was an across-the-board improvement in the skill level of the people who were in the program, even more significant than in the EI sample. So a really important result in terms of this upskilling opportunities offered by this program. Next slide, please. So what are some of the big findings, just to kind of bring this all to a conclusion? There was strong labor market attachment. When you offer people a job, they take it. A good job, they take it. There was less poverty, better quality of life, less financial stress. These are all based on surveys during and after the program. Better quality of work after, and importantly, something that often gets neglected, people's social networks improved dramatically in this program. Really were able to make much better connections between themselves and potential new work afterwards. So that's another important outcome. Next slide, please. And I see there's a question, Martin, so I'll stop and happy to take it. Or is there? Maybe not.
Nope, there's not a question.
Oh, I just saw it flashing. I'm sorry. The community benefited. They got all this kind of social capital, higher incidence of trust. This is a big finding for the treatment communities. The communities that had the program saw improved trust, higher social capital for the people who were involved. And they got all these volunteers. They got a few thousand out. They got 2,250 free employment years for the social economy sector that produced real things that made real differences in people's lives. Not just for the recipients of the program, the benefit participants in the program, but also the people who are getting the services. So some of the cost benefit analysis, there's $1 spent is a net, they figured generate a net benefit of $1.02 and $1.39 for the EI and the income assistance. That should say income assistance respectively. I did this presentation in French the first time, missed that change. If they take a more expansive model, one where they try to account for all the benefits, so these kind of more intangible benefits in terms of networks and trust, They find that for the dollar spent, they get a benefit of $1.21 for the EI sample and $1.61 for the income assistance sample. So these are big benefits for your buck, right? You're getting real clear outcomes that are cost effective. So that's the big takeaway, is this program can be effective, not just from the perspective of the individuals or the communities, but even from a kind of government cost perspective, if that's your primary concern. Next slide, please. Oh, this gets cut off a little bit. But look, at the end of the day, this is how they conclude their study. It is a viable and very efficient policy tool for achieving the dual goal of supporting unemployed individuals and vulnerable communities. It's not great if you just see this as, we're just going to help these participants. If that's your lens, this doesn't look quite as good from a cost perspective. If your lens is widened to the communities and this larger sense of social capital and networks, then it makes a ton of sense from a conventional cost benefit analysis perspective. I think there's reasons to kind of challenge that, and I'll conclude with that thought. Next slide, please. So how does this stack up with the job guarantee? I'm going to run through this quickly because I've been blathering on for a long time here. Look, the funding at this thing was federal and provincial. The job guarantee people say it should be strictly federal. Federal government has the capacity, provinces don't. The control should be at the local level. Both the proponents of a job guarantee and the designers of this program agree. Do they have planification grants? The job guarantee people haven't thought about that. The people who did this project in Cape Breton did, and it's important. So that's something you can learn. A job database, both programs had that. Mandatory participation, no in both cases. People could refuse work in this community employment innovation project just like they could in the job guarantee. Eligibility, well, of course, by design, this was a targeted program, a pilot project, so it wouldn't be universal, but the idea is that it would be if it was brought to a larger scale. Economic reasoning, this is important, or framework. The people who propose the job guarantee have what's called a modern monetary framework in the back of their mind. The people who designed this have a standard, a kind of more conventional economic perspective, a more neoclassical, microeconomic, cost-benefit kind of perspective in mind. So that's important, but I think that also suggests they can each learn from each other, and that's one of my big takeaways from this. If we go to the next slide, please. What about the benefits? Oh, rigorous evaluation framework. Yes, of course, recommended, but this here was done in a very persuasive way. Is it universal? No, of course, we just talked about that. Educational and apprenticeship opportunities, absolutely, both were favorable towards that. Work flexibility, the job guarantee proponents say, yes, this program didn't actually build that in, but it could easily be adapted that way. Fair wage, yes. Type of work, same kind of work. Care for people, care for community, and care for the environment. Those are the kind of headings that would qualify or classify or categorize that kind of work. Next slide, please. And benefits for the social economy in the job guarantee program. This is the left column here. Yes, but a hypothesis only. Here in the Community Employment Innovation Project, demonstrated. So really brilliant. Social capital, not measured, rarely talked about in the job guarantee program. In the Community Employment Innovation Program, measured, huge benefits. And in cost benefit analysis, so the job guarantee people have done macroeconomic modeling. The Community Employment Innovation Policy people did microeconomic modeling. So a nice pairing. You can see how these two things could really go together and learn from each other. And that's kind of ultimately my objective. If we can go to the next slide, please. So what are the lessons? For those who want a job guarantee on a national universal scale, we need to finance democratic participation. That's not something that's been modeled in the macroeconomic modeling work that's been done in the United States, but it should be. We need to recognize that small communities may have capacity constraints. In the Cape Breton study, there's a community called Dominion, has a population of 1,200. They couldn't get their act together. Some of these communities just don't have capacity to do this. And so the people who think about the job guarantee need to be cognizant of that and design accordingly. We need to remind ourselves also that some of the employment insurance recipients are less interested in this. They're waiting for a job. So only 27% of those people who were mailed or were contacted who were collecting EI actually showed up for the information meeting. Of those who showed up, 67% signed on at the info meeting, okay? In the US modeling that I talked about earlier, they assume a 68 to 84% take-up rate. So much, much higher than we observed in reality. And just for comparison purposes, the income assistance people, 69% of those who were contacted showed up, and 90% actually signed up. So there's a real big disparity. Again, back to that question that was asked earlier, the people who are likely to take this program are the people who most likely are the people who are most challenged by the current environment, current economy, the people who have had the hardest time getting into the labor market altogether. They're the people who are going to have the least skill and can most benefit. And so it's a very targeted program in that way. That's one of the critiques of a job income guarantee is it's not targeted. This is a very targeted program, and it does it by itself automatically, as long as it's well designed. Next slide, please. So there's clear benefits for participants, communities, and the social economy. We need to think about these social goods and trust benefits. And I think the big conclusion for me is people are not lazy. That's an assumption kind of, you know, in economics, we assume people are trading off leisure against income. I think most of the time people actually want to work, and they don't need to get paid a lot of money. They just need to feel like the work is meaningful and contributing both to themselves and their community. The people in this program had the opportunity to go back and sit at home and do nothing and collect their income assistance. They wouldn't be a whole lot worse off financially, but they would be a whole lot worse off socially. And most of them didn't choose that. Most of them chose to stay working. So that's really important. And so lastly, last theme, next slide, please. How are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for it? Let's talk about that. Next slide, please. Look, if you've been paying attention lately, you'll notice that governments all over the world have done things that people said were impossible or not advised, ill-advised. Here's a headline from the, I think it's Financial Times or one of these papers. The Bank of England is now financing UK government spending directly. In Canada, the Bank of Canada routinely buys up to 20% of all government debt. It's been doing that for decades, okay? People don't understand this, but we already do monetary financing. It's always been done in Canada, and it continues to be done. We're just increasing it. If you go to the next slide, please. So if we're worried about where the money's going to come from, that's where the money's going to come from. Here's a slide from heading from the New York Times. How the government pulls coronavirus relief money out of thin air. This is a long conversation about what money is and where it comes from, but it's important to understand that we've been operating under some bad ideas, at least in my view, about these things for a long time. And if we'd been lucky, next slide, please, we would have had a chance to hear more about this from Stephanie. She was supposed to be our Tansley lecturer, and unfortunately, for reasons we all know, that didn't happen. My last slide, So earlier I quoted Pope Francis. I'm a Pope John Paul era guy, that's why I get So interestingly, if you read the headlines, if you're paying attention, almost everyone characterized what he said as support for a universal income, a guaranteed income. But what he actually said was he was supportive of a universal job, a universal wage. And so I've underlined, so I just find that fascinating. People have blended these things in their minds and don't realize there's actually a really big difference. It must be clear that the real goal is to reach not for income for all, but rather work for all. Because without work for all, there'd be no dignity for all. The work of today and that of tomorrow will be different, perhaps very different. Anyway, you can go on. But the point is, it's just an observation that the headings almost universally, what I took away when I was following this 2 weeks ago, was it was an income guarantee, but in fact, it was a job guarantee he was advocating for. So we'll stop there, and I'm happy to have questions. I'd love to have questions. Thank you very much, Martin, and everyone.
Yeah, that's great, Mark and Marc-Andre. And I would invite everyone to ask questions. Feel free to put questions on the chat form, as well as I didn't ask you before this, Marc-Andre, but I think it's safe to assume that you'd be comfortable with folks kind of turning their kind of mute off and video on, and have a little bit more of a chat. We have about 30 minutes, so we can really kind of dig into this a bit.
And Martin, I'll welcome questions in French too, if they have them.
I'll have difficulty moderating in the French part. I just have the French name, that's it. So we have our first question here from, and I'm not going to do a good job pronouncing this person's name, Merdad. Comparing the current crisis with the global financial crisis, 2007, 2008, do you think we will have a greater depression in the upcoming years? Also considering technology, especially artificial intelligence, do you think it can help us to get out of this depression or it will boost it. And my last question is, what is your prediction regarding inflation unemployment rates if we are going to have, and is this a way to avoid it by precautionary measures now? Okay, Marc-Andre, you took on a very big policy issue, and I guess you're getting some very big questions in return. But any thoughts around those things in general?
So I'm going to default back on the first question. You know, when I worked at the Levy Institute, worked with this guy, Wynne Godley. He used to be the kind of probably the go-to economic forecasters in the UK throughout the 70s into the early 80s, and then he was cast as a Keynesian and he got pushed out of the tent basically. But he retreated to the Levy Institute like a lot of Keynesians did, and he would always say to me, Marc-Andre, I don't do point forecasts. I don't try to predict that there's going to be a recession or depression next year. What I talk about are big societal trends and the tendencies that they bring with them and the likelihood of a problem resulting from them. So he was pointing out to, for example, in the late 90s, he was pointing to rising household debt, right? Increasing securitization of mortgages, government budget balances. Interestingly, he thought that was a very negative sign in the US and Canada. And he was saying these are not sustainable trends. And so I think we are in a world of not sustainable trends. So I'm not going to say there's going to be a recession or depression next year. We're already likely in a recession, depression right now, but whether we'll come out of that is really a function of how we're willing to change and if we're willing to change the way we think about our economy. And I'm frankly a little pessimistic. I think there's already a lot of noise if you read the papers about how we're going to have to really cut back on spending or increase taxes coming out of this to get back to balance. At the federal level, I would agree with that policy approach at the provincial and municipal level, but not the federal level. And I think that if people believe that and act on that belief, this is not a good trend. I won't say it's going to be a recession or depression. There's too many variables, but I do think that is an unsustainable idea. And unfortunately, I think we're still captive to it. I don't think technology is going to save us. That's my general view. I think technology creates as many problems as it solves. And then inflation, I will go out on the edge and say that I don't think inflation is going anywhere unless there's a supply shock, unless our supply chains get completely disrupted. Right now, we have a deflation problem. We have oil prices that are in some cases negative in a future sense. We have high unemployment and growing. We have excess capacity coming from China. I really, really have a hard time seeing an inflation problem in the short term.
That's great. I think we'll take a question from Michael Atkinson, and he recently turned on his video, so I think I'll let him ask the question himself.
Hold on.
Yep.
Oh, you unmuted me. Thank you. Well, it was just a short question, Marc-Andre. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. Really stimulating. Was there any kind of stigma attached to the jobs that were produced in the Cape Breton program? I guess I just worry about these kinds of programs creating a kind of dichotomous attitude on the part of people toward them as some kind of second-rate project program. What was the feeling generally about the Cape Breton experience?
You know, I can't answer that question directly, Michael. I don't know, and maybe I read it and I don't remember it, but I don't recall discussion about that. I do know that there was a sense of trust, and people were involved in the program were generally appreciative, and the fact that they stayed in the program does tell you something about how they viewed it, and how the community viewed it. If this was highly stigmatized, I would have guessed that people would have dropped out. They would have gone and collected EI, because they could have collected EI. After they put in their hours, they could have done what everyone else is doing, go and collect EI. They could have gone on income assistance, what they used to do. But the fact that they stayed in the program is, for me, very telling of the stigma or lack thereof associated with the program. The other thing, the important thing is to emphasize that the people who designed that program, not this program, but the job guarantee in general, are very aware of this concern. And that's partly why they've focused on the social economy and those kind of care for community, care for environment, so on, care for people.
And if you can build a training component in, if you can give people a sense that they can use the experience and it's valued so that they can use it and point to it as they look for other kinds of jobs in the labor market, then I think you can begin to overcome this. I take your point about the lack of dropout. That's a good indication that stigma may not be the biggest problem that these programs face.
Yeah, and I just to add to that, I mean, from a bit of personal experience, I've volunteered at the, what's it called? The Friendship Inn in Saskatoon. And there are people who work there and they take incredible pride in their work, and they should. It's incredible work, and they get something out of that work that's not money, that's a sense of giving and community that I think this kind of work, at least potentially, could offer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks a lot, Michael. And again, everyone feel free to kind of like turn your video microphone on, ask questions. We can have this as a bit more of a dialogue. I'll go to Keith's question now. His question is, how are the projects administered locally? All of the mundane things like payroll, keeping records, supervision, evaluation, etc. And given current moves to provide accommodation for folks with special different needs, does the change at all the definition of able to work vis-a-vis the concept? So getting into some of the details of this.
That's a great question. And you know, I wish I had been there. I wish I'd designed the study, because then I would know these things, you know, intimately, but I can only tell you what I've read. And what I read was that because these were programs delivered by existing social economy institutions, they already had capacity, you know, maybe around payroll and record keeping and all those kind of management type of things. They might have had only 1 or 2 employees, but suddenly they had 4 or 5, right? And so it was just a matter of expanding. Now, I say that just a matter. I'm sure it was complicated. I'm sure it wasn't easy. But by and large, one of the big results, which I didn't talk about, is those social economy entities, they all were incredibly grateful for this program because it gave them time to plan strategically, which they never have. They're always just running from one operational problem or issue to another. And with the extra support of these people in the program, they were suddenly able to take more of a strategic vision to what they were bringing to the community. So they had the payroll, they had the administrative capacity, and by bringing people on, they could actually push some of that work onto these people that we're hiring, give them the training, and it'll free themselves up for more of the strategic work that a management, senior level management should be doing. In fact, if you read the social economy literature, this is a perennial complaint of social economy people. They're always just like, I have no time to breathe. How am I going to plan my strategy if I'm just trying to put out fires all the time? So this program really addressed that issue in a substantive way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks. We have another question from Ham987. How will you convince people that the public sector can improve labor productivity than the matching process through the invisible hand of the private sector? Another question, and you could sort of answer this in whatever order you prefer. What is the relative advantage and disadvantage of job guarantee compared to income guarantee and better public services?
Okay. Well, I'm not a big believer in the invisible hand. I think the hand's quite visible, actually. I think markets only exist when they're structured by government, and so you policymakers are. If you want to use that term, we're part of the invisible hand. Policymakers are. We make markets happen, and in fact, there's a great anarchist researcher named David Graeber who talks about this. Every time there's a effort to get the government out of some sector, what you end up seeing is just a layering of rules and bureaucracy behind the scenes to support this so-called freeing up of the market. So I think, you know, we build a false dichotomy oftentimes between the market and government, and we really need to kind of shed some of that thinking. So that's my first thought. In terms of how you convince people, you show them. You show them. That's all there is to it. I mean, look, what happened after the Great Depression? There was widespread support for these kinds of ideas. Why? People saw the output. They saw the murals. They went to a play. They saw the trees. They saw the soil erosion problem being addressed. They stayed in a park. They saw the benefits. And so you show people. You don't talk about it like I'm doing. You show them. And you need to do something to show them. So that's the difference. And I think we spend, you know, policymakers, I think we get, you know, one of my big critiques of a lot of policy, and this is to your next question, is we try to carve it up to just be this perfect targeted effort. And by doing that, we inevitably build complexity. And by building complexity, we inevitably reduce take-up. And I think, you know, I like to say, I should put this on my door. If you want to build a policy that no one's going to use, you make it complex and you target the hell out of it. This is a program that is simple, people will understand. And I think it's kind of got this advantage relative to the income guarantee because, look, I follow threads on Twitter. I'm friends with Armin Yelnitsin, one of the kind of prominent, she works for not ISED, but HRSDC. What was our HRSDC? I don't know what it's called anymore. But she's and very been active in the rolling out of these $2,000 checks, or certainly commenting on it. And she's in touch with a lot of labor economists. And I love Armin, but she's very critical of an income guarantee because she says, well, how are you going to do this? You're going to send a $1,000 check to somebody or $2,000 check. And if they need a wheelchair, are they going to have to use that to buy a wheelchair? Are we going to get rid of all these other programs just to fund this thing? Because for the most part, people who advocate for an income guarantee are working within a conventional fiscal framework. Well, if I'm going to pay for that, I got to cut here to spend there. And so we're going to take away things to give things. And then we're going to ask people who have dire circumstances, maybe they're disabled in some kind, or they have some other challenge, mental health, and we're going to give them $2,000 and we're going to expect them to figure everything out. Well, that's not very smart, compassionate, or right, I think. And in fact, I don't think it's a good policy way of addressing policy. The other thing that I worry about, because when I worked at the Levy Institute, I worked with a guy named Carl Widerquist, who is a leading proponent globally of a guaranteed income. And Carl was one of my best friends, and we'd argue about this all the time. And Carl, I'd always say to Carl, what do you do? If I'm getting an income guarantee, I'm guaranteed a stream of income for the next 12 months, $2,000 check going to come in every month, let's say. Well, the first thing I might do is if I'm a business person, I'm going to go and offer people a discount. I'll give you your money right now. You sign over your next 12 checks. I'm going to, instead of, you would collect 24,000 over the year, I'll give you 20 grand right now. And you commit, you sign a contract, you're going to shift the 2,000 on me. I'm going to get, as the person giving you $20,000, I'm going to get $4,000 gain at the end of the year. I'm going to come out happy. You're going to get your money right away. You don't have to wait all year. What do you think people who have substance abuse and other problems, what are they going to do with that money? They're going to blow it. These people who are going to be receiving these things suffer from what's called the packing problem. Their lives are so dense. They have every decision's a trade-off. If I buy this, it means I can't buy that. If I buy my daughter a gift for Christmas, that means I'm buying less for food. These are incredibly stressful decisions. And when you're working in that situation, I don't care who you are, if you had a PhD or not a high school degree, if you're put in that situation, you're going to make bad decisions. You're going to make bad decisions. So I'm going to give you you're going to be ripe for abuse by people who are a little unscrupulous. And we're going to say, hey, they'll dangle $20,000 in front of you. You're going to blow the money and you're going to be suffering at the end of the year. This is all very predictable behavior. And it's part of the reason why I've been long skeptical of an income guarantee. I parked that momentarily to help write that editorial, but I'm still, as you can tell, a much more strong advocate of a job guarantee.
I have a bit of a follow-up question with that. Like, have you given any thought? So this is sort of a big endeavor with potential unintended consequences that we might not even be able to imagine. And when faced from a kind of a policy analysis perspective, when faced with this kind of approach, the typical way to roll things out and implementing, to pursue implementation is through pilot projects or something like that. Have you given a thought to what would you say to the Prime Minister or some deputy about what this would look like in terms of next steps?
Right. Good question, Martin. I mean, I would say, look at the results of this program. It was a Liberal government, by the way, that put this in play, if it was a current environment. And I'd say, look, you've got some evidence for a program that could work. There's always a risk. Any policy, there's a risk of unintended consequences. We go forth into the unknown with the best intentions and the best hopes, and we're always ready to adapt and adjust as we go forward. I recognize that risk. But I think I'd highlight as well the important macroeconomic stabilization benefits and the kind of responsiveness and the capacity building and the resilience this kind of program would build in structure into society. So imagine we had this program and COVID-19 hits. We're not going to send people to work necessarily because we don't want them to socially distance, but we could pay them to sit at home, maybe do nothing, or we could say some people, maybe you have skills in sewing. We're going to pay you to build masks. We have a reserve army of people who we're paying, and we can ask them to produce something. And people are doing that of their own free will. Imagine if you paid them. And so we could imagine all sorts of kind of ways that this program builds in resilience for these kinds of shocks, builds in resilience for whatever kind of shock we know is going to come next, and gives us capacity to build real capacity. Okay, I always, people put a lot of emphasis on finances, but I put a lot of emphasis on real capacity. Do we have good access to water? Do we have good access to parks? Do we have good roads? Do we have good food, good bridges, good schools? Those are the things that matter the most. The accounting entries, which we call deficits and debt, those are distributional variables. They're about who owns what and controls what. They're important, but they're less important than the real things. And we're seeing that right now in this crisis, and we need to be mindful of that when we make our policy decisions. So that's what I'd say. I mean, next step would be, let's do this. We didn't, I think with a lot of these programs, we need to be a little bold and try them. I realize there's always a risk with that, but I think there's a risk in going in half measures because the political cycle kills things very easily, as we've seen repeatedly over history.
Oh, that's great. Do we have any other questions from the group before Marc-Andre changes our entire economic system?
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Martin. I'm Ham 987. Hi,
Hey,
Marc-Andre. That's my name. Sorry, just default on the screen. So I really enjoy the conversation. I'm as an economist, we are trained to deeply believe income is better than anything else because they give people freedom of choice. That means efficiency, right? Marc-Andre, I'm sure you know the theory. And so compared between job guarantee and the income guarantee, if we want to convince me job guarantee is better, then that means job guarantee first is a more efficient labor market. So government can match people of different skills and potential with the job that they where they should work on. Second, the public market, I agree, the dichotomy between public private is kind of illusionary. We could have an entire one market. However, even for the government sector, there you need the matching process, right? So how can you ensure that process is better? The market itself should be a market. The public sector job market is a market itself. Second, the public sector, I like your point about real capacity. Yeah, accounting or just financial numbers are not as important as the real capacity. If we really want to develop real capacity of people, then how this job guarantee program will help in terms of education, training, come back to the old idea of better matching, better developing this potential. Okay, that's my question.
Okay. Thank you, Ham 987.
Not a real ham.
So those are tough questions, Haijian, and important questions. I mean, I think the way I would characterize it, and maybe this is, I'm always guilty of bias like anyone else. Especially when I lived in the United States, I encountered a lot of people who were just completely left out of the market. The market didn't match them. It didn't give them any opportunity. They were completely marginalized. There's a huge part of the population that's just given up on the idea of work because there's no one that's going to hire them. The only time they get hired is when the economy is running red hot. And like I said earlier, they're the last to get hired and the first to get fired. So we've made a societal choice that's how we adjust to the economic cycle. And I think there's a more humane way to do it. And one that not only is humane, but that is economically efficient because it gives people like that who've been born behind the 9-ball or the 8-ball, sorry. And I'll just digress a tiny bit. My wife works in the inner city school here and the kids, mostly indigenous, it's unimaginable how far behind they start. They can't read or write by the time they're in grade 5. They have no muscle tone because they're not used to exercise. They live in tiny apartments with 10 people. They have no food. They show up to school. Maybe they have a cookie. They don't have gloves or toque. I mean, it's unimaginable, but there is a huge segment of our population that live and start from that place on the racetrack. And we just choose to let them stay there. We could choose differently, and we could choose to help them by equipping them with these basic skills. And in so doing, vastly improve our capacity, our real capacity. These people are smart, they're capable, they have good intentions. We just need to be aware of that. And we need to give them the opportunity to put those into action, just like we all want that opportunity. We all want to be able to realize ourselves. And so these jobs are a way to do that. You're not forced to stay in. You can go, if you find, you know what, I'm suddenly pretty good at looking after kids, go start your own daycare. You can do that. You're not stuck there. This is not a forced job. That's important. It's not workfare. And so I see that this is efficiency enhancing because we're taking people that are, this was Kane's point. It's so improbable that people believe it's a good idea that people do nothing and lose their skills and suffer all these consequences. How can we even conceptualize that? We don't believe that's true for our own children. We don't believe that's true for our family, but we believe it's true society-wide. It makes no sense to me, but we do believe that implicitly. And so what this program does is it addresses that. It says we're going to give those people a real chance, and we're going to protect them just like I would protect my kids and give them every opportunity. We're going to do the same for our fellow brethren through this program, and we're going to be doing it in a way that is good for everyone. So I see this as a positive, and if it builds trust, trust is efficiency enhancing too. And you'll know from the institutional literature that the more we have trust, the less contractual work we need to do, the more we can do through just straight up communication. This is efficiency enhancing too. And so again, there's just so many ways that when you include people, you get efficiency benefits that are not obvious from a conventional economics perspective. But if you have exposed yourself to that world of people who have nothing, then they start becoming a little more clear. And so I'm lucky because I get my wife hearing these stories every day about kids who really, it brings a tear to your eye how far behind they start. And we deserve as a society, just like we're thinking now about all those people who are doing our groceries and whatnot, we need to think like that all the time. And this is what this program would do.
Thank you.
Any questions from the group? Looks like Paul unmuted his mic. Do you have a question, Paul?
Okay. Yes, I was just wondering, you seem to imply that you'd keep social and employment insurance, and so that those remain in your set of policies.
Right.
The federal government would have.
Yeah, and provincial. Yeah.
Presumably, you might have some suggestions for improving those programs, but that's maybe a matter for another time.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that some people won't be able to work. You know, like so we talked that some people maybe have situations where they're just not feasible. They have mental health issues. They have other physical challenges. And so we don't want to kind of, again, this is back to the critique of the guaranteed income. We don't want to dump those programs. We need programs that are tailored to people's circumstances that are, you know, maybe housing programs. We still need those things. We don't want people, employers suddenly recognizing that there's these people they can charge more rent to, you know, so we you know, that's part, again, one of the critiques of guaranteed income is that income can quickly get eaten up. So we wouldn't want to ditch other ways that we help people necessarily. We need to think about that, of course, comprehensively, and there may be some nips and tucks here and there, but I think it's important to not to kind of think of this conceptually as an add-on as opposed to a subtraction, and both for good policy reasons, but also for good political reasons.
Thanks.
Oh, Paul, do you have a follow-up point? Oh.
Thanks.
Nope. Thank you, Paul. Any other questions? We have a few minutes left here with Marc-Andre. Any other questions from the group? Well, I'll be greedy and I'll take the last question there, Marc-Andre. So you started off the presentation making some reference to the Green New Deal. And I was really interested in that. My area is energy transitions and climate change. And Unfortunately, we have this COVID crisis, and then we have another crisis that we have to sort of manage right after this that could potentially be even more devastating than COVID-19. And it is labor heavy. There's lots of all kinds of jobs that we could be doing to move that forward. But it seems on the surface, maybe there's some alignment with this idea that you have. But from hearing you speak a little bit more in depth about it, it's a bit of a different program. Do you see any kind of synergies with that sort of idea of a Green New Deal, or having sort of an energy transition, job focused approach to come out of COVID?
That's a really good question, Martin. So, I mean, I know one of the big challenges around the transition from kind of fossil fuel based economy would be precisely that dislocation of lots of people who work in those sectors now, right? And so where would they go is always the question, the political question and the real economic question. So this program at least ostensibly could offer people an opportunity, a venue, if that transition started happening. So it could assist with the transition. It's important to recognize or keep in mind the policy principle around not trying to encroach on the private sector. As much as possible, you want to kind of respect that line, as we do live in a market economy, and I think there are important benefits to a market economy. And so I would just be mindful of that. But I think it's important to think of it as a buffer stock that kind of ebbs and flows, like an inventory that ebbs and flows depending on the economic cycle, depending on whatever structural changes we're trying to make, like maybe transitioning from fossil fuels. And then, of course, there's the care for environment component around. This is not necessarily climate change, but we could get people to plant trees, or I don't know, things that have environmental benefits and climate change benefits, but aren't maybe directly, tied to it. So that's I think that's part of the reason it was included in the policy program. And I think we're, just as an aside, I think with the oil prices where they are, this is not a great sign for any kind of such transition. The economic signals are telling us to use gas and oil and not invest in windmills, and but I do see some opportunity for this program to do that with those restrictions in mind, those constraints in mind.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marc-Andre. Really appreciate it. Really invigorating discussion. We have lots of great questions. How about if there's a nice little reaction button, we can show our appreciation for Marc-Andre. You can give him a thumbs up or a clap, or put some
thumbs down. That's okay too. You should have shaved. That's what people want to say. You should have shaved.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming for this presentation.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, everyone.